Hey everybody, Dr. Snellgrove here, and I'm gambling that I can squeeze this recording in before my next class. All right, so this video is focusing on chapter 15. In our book, it starts on page 333. We'll take those numbers to Vegas. Although, as usual, you don't get into the real content of the chapter until the following page, 334. So this is all about run-on sentences, and I do like the book has a pretty straightforward definition of a run-on sentence at the top of 334. It says it's not one sentence, but two or more that run together without proper punctuation. And so they give a good example here by the X. Brittany knew her research paper was due the next day. She could not push herself to work on it. All right, so it's probably obvious as you read it or as I say it out loud, but we've got two separate independent clauses there, two things that could have been sentences on their own. Brittany knew her research paper was due the next day, and she could not push herself to work on it. So if we're going to join these guys together, these two independent clauses together, as you know, normally we would need a comma and then a coordinated conjunction, or maybe just pop a semicolon in between them. But right now, in this example, it's got neither of those things. That's what makes it a run-on sentence. It just kept on barreling without anything pausing it. And so as your book points out, that is called a fused sentence. Two thoughts fused together with no punctuation to separate them. And I know it's like I'm incapable of, I think, of recording one of these without saying something about this, but this is yet another example where your ear might catch this kind of error in your own writing quicker than your eyes will. You know, a lot of people will read over their own run-on sentences maybe several times and not notice that they are run-on sentences. But if you actually read this out loud, like Brittany knew her research paper was due the next day, she could not push herself to work on it. It sounds like there should be a pause there. It sounds like a person is just blurting a lot of stuff out really quickly. All right. Now, I think we may have touched on this. I may have at least mentioned it in a previous recording. But on the bottom half of 334, we get into what is a comma splice. And so this is a different type of run-on sentence where, you know, you have where you would normally have a comma and a coordinating conjunction. You only have the comma. So they have the same thing we just did before, slightly different. Brittany knew her research paper was due the next day, comma, she could not push herself to work on it. All right, so it's better in the sense that at least the comma gives us a little bit of a pause between the ideas, but it is officially half-assing it, right? Because we needed a comma and we needed a coordinating conjunction. If you only have a comma, well, that's how you get a run-on sentence, right there. Specifically, that's how you get a comma splice. All right, and let's see. So I'm going to skip over the exercise on the bottom of 334 and jump to 335 because this is arguably the most important. I guess this is really what the entire rest of this short chapter focuses on almost is how do you fix run-on sentences? And so why does the rest of the chapter focus on this? Well, the short answer is you have a lot of different ways of fixing a run-on sentence. All right, on page 335, they get into maybe the most obvious example. So by definition, run-on sentences mean that we have two or more sentences that could have been complete sentences on their own. So the first method for fixing run-on sentences is just to turn them into sentences. That's why they say method one, period, and a capital letter. So we have an example of a run-on. The technician flipped a switch red and green lights blinked on the control panel. It's like, all right, well, that was an example of we had a coordinated conjunction, but we had no comma in between. That's what made it a run-on sentence. So we could just fix it. The technician flipped a switch, period. Red and green lights blinked on the control panel, period. Two sets of independent clauses, two subject, verb, complete thoughts right there. All right, so that's pretty easy, pretty maybe self-explanatory even. All right, so looking on 336, this builds, I think, on some skills that you already have based on our previous chapters, but, you know, we've been talking about normally you would join your independent clauses together by using a comma and a coordinated conjunction. So they do a reminder of that on page 36. I'm sorry, 336. So we start out with an example of a run-on sentence. Andrea had the day off, comma, she went shopping. All right, we had a comma, we had no coordinated conjunction, so therefore we have a comma splice. So easiest way to fix this, since the comma is already there, we'll just add the appropriate coordinating conjunction. Andrea had the day off, comma, so she went shopping. So if you need it, there is a little refresher at the bottom of the page. Those are our 7 coordinating conjunctions, and the way the book encourages you to remember them: fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. I guess you could rearrange it, boy fans, there's no judgments here, as long as you can remember what those coordinating conjunctions are. And then when you're fixing run-on sentences or just joining any of your sentences together, as I think we talked about before, you want to pick the most logical one. So, previously we had Andrea had the day off, comma, so she went shopping. Obviously the word so connotes cause and effect. Because she had the day off, she went shopping. Think about how weird and off-putting this sentence would have been, though, if we were like, Andrea had the day off, but she went shopping. You normally would use but or yet to introduce surprising or contradictory info. Here, that would be out of place. So was the only coordinating conjunction we could use. All right. On page 337, we have arguably my favorite piece of punctuation ever on the bottom half of the page, the semicolon. All right. So this is one way that you can fix run-on sentences. And for my face-to-face students and online students, if they ever want to come see me, I'll sometimes tell you, like, hey, if you want to bring in like a printed out copy of your paper, I'll proofread it. I'm happy to do that for you. And I very often will be suggesting semicolons when I'm editing. And the reason for it, students have a lot of comma splices. So you can imagine me like hunched over correcting these papers, especially if I have a lot of them. I will often go with the quickest way to fix something. So it's like if you already had a comma splice, the easiest way to fix it, quote unquote, would be to turn that comma into a semicolon and call it a day. And the reason for that, they have a little reminder for you on 337. Semicolon can join independent clauses where the ideas are related. So in other words, the thing on the opposite side of a semicolon needs to be its own independent clause, needs to be its own subject, verb, complete thought. It does not need to be capitalized though, because it is the same, part of the same sentence. So they have an example for us on the bottom of 337. The book section is to the right as patrons enter the library. Journals and periodicals are to the left. All right, so there was a comma there. As patrons enter the library, comma, journals and periodicals are to the left. So as we've talked about in this chapter, if you've got the comma but no coordinating conjunction, you've got a comma splice. And so an alternate way of fixing it, we could have just added a coordinating conjunction in here, right? Patrons enter the library, comma, and journals and periodicals are to the left, or maybe but journals and periodicals are to the left. But instead, the book is saying, hey, we can just patrons enter the library, semicolon, journals and periodicals are to the left. And I'm glad, it may seem a little weird, a little pedantic, but I'm glad the book is giving you an overview of all of these different ways of fixing a run-on sentence, because so much of writing is style. One of the things I say very often in my classes, in my lectures, is writing is a visual language. And sometimes students are looking at me like, no, duh, old man. But what I mean by that is there's times that you might want to choose to use a semicolon instead of a comma and a coordinating conjunction, just because you want to put some visual variety in your essay. Sometimes it may be as simple as, I've already got a lot of commas in this paragraph. I'm going to do a semicolon over here instead, just to mix things up, just to add a little visual variety for the reader. Okay, so on page 338, they discuss a kind of modified semicolon method, semicolon and transitional expressions. So the basic idea here is that, I mentioned a minute ago that you want to have a semicolon. It needs to join things where the ideas are related. That's step one. And ideally, well, maybe I should back up a little bit. With semicolons, we don't have coordinating conjunctions, right? We don't normally have semicolon and, for, but, or, yet, so, or anything like that. But you can use these transitional expressions, and they have a list, not a full list, but a list of commonly used ones at the top of 339. These are basically words that you might want to use after the semicolon and before the next independent clause, just to make things make more sense. So they have an example here on, a negative example first, bottom of page 338. Traffic was heavy. The rain made it almost impossible to see the road. All right. So as written, that is a classic run-on. We've got traffic was heavy, subject, verb, complete thought. The rain made it almost impossible to see the road, subject, verb, complete thought. No pause in between these things, right? So we need to fix it somehow. And so we can't just pop a semicolon. Traffic was heavy, semicolon. The rain made it almost impossible to see the road. So why wouldn't we just use a semicolon there? Well, technically speaking, these sound like very different things, right? Traffic was heavy, as in there's a lot of cars on the road. The rain made it almost impossible to see the road. We're talking about very different road conditions here, right? Crowded road, rainy road. And so the book suggests you could use the transitional expression furthermore. So traffic was heavy, semicolon. Furthermore, the rain made it almost impossible to see the road. So furthermore is a way of telling the reader, like, I'm about to tell you even more issues that I faced while I was driving. And so that incomplete list on the top of page 339, this includes stuff like accordingly, as a result, besides, consequently, finally, for example, however, in addition. And so all of these can help you. It just depends on how you want to set up your sentences. So I've been skipping most of these exercises because a lot of them are straightforward, but we'll look at a few here, I think, on middle of 339. So the idea is to correct this run-on sentence here, to correct this run-on sentence or comma splice by using a semicolon and a transitional expression. So if you look at number one, we've got Tia thought she could get by without studying, her grades suffered. Okay, so as usual, it's two independent clauses that are just smushed together there. So we can do Tia thought she could get by without studying, semicolon. And then consequently, her grades suffered. So if you look at that list of commonly used transitional words and expressions, consequently is one of the ones, obviously, that is used for a cause and effect format. So we're saying, hey, she didn't study, semicolon, consequently, her grades suffered. One thing led to another. Let's see. Number two, the lake was beautiful and clear. Cans, bottles, and fast food wrappers littered the beach alongside it. Okay, so this is maybe the best illustration so far of why you might need to use transitional expressions. So the lake was beautiful, semicolon. I'm sorry, the lake was beautiful and clear, semicolon. But then we have cans, bottles, and fast food wrappers littered the beach alongside it. So that can be kind of jarring for the reader, right? We're going from clear lake to cluttered beach. So what you can do here, the lake was beautiful and clear, semicolon. However, cans, bottles, and fast food wrappers littered the beach alongside it. So when it comes to transitional expressions, however is one of the words that you can use to, like, hey, I'm telling my reader I'm about to drop some surprising or contradictory info on here. So it's like, it is surprising because when you hear the lake is clear, it's kind of jarring to hear that the beach itself is, or yeah, the land, yeah, the beach, I guess is the right word for it, is so polluted. In case you were wondering, I was having a moment there, like, is it still called a beach when it's a lake and not the ocean? The answer is yes. All right. And we will look at one more, maybe we'll look at number three. I guess we'll just go in order. Philippe looked at expensive home theater equipment for hours. He decided that what he had was good enough. All right, so we've got a classic comma splice there. Philippe looked at expensive home theater equipment for hours, comma. That should be a semicolon. What do we put after that as a transitional expression? Well, we know that he was doing this for a long time, right? He was doing it for hours. So the most logical A transitional expression to use there would be finally. So Philippe looked at expensive home theater equipment for hours, semicolon. Finally, he decided that what he had was good enough. All right. And this is probably obvious from the chapter, but I'll say it anyway, just to make sure we are clear. So after you use these transitional expressions, you normally need to have a comma. But this is something that may be familiar to you already because the transitional expressions appear at the beginning of your second independent clause in all of these examples. And we've talked about before, I think, that you would normally put a comma around the word or phrase you are beginning a clause with, right? And just to ring that bell one more time in this recording, this is another one where if you're saying this stuff out loud, you would normally put a pause after stuff like accordingly, as a result, finally. You would put a pause there anyway. So once again, yes, you are putting commas where you normally put pauses. All right. The bottom of page 339 going to the top of page 340, you can tell I'm from Lower Alabama, right? 340, we have using dependent words. So this is kind of, in some ways, the nuclear option of fixing your run-on sentence problem. Because we talked about this from the very beginning. Run-on sentences, by definition, we are combining multiple independent clauses, multiple things that could be sentences on their own. We've jammed them into one large run-on thing. So in this section, it talks about like, hey, you can always put a dependent word in front of one of the independent clauses, makes it dependent. So now, depending on how you set it up, you no longer have any grammatical issues to worry about. So here is I'll do a slightly modified example. Might be better for you to see. Well, actually, we'll just look at this kind of in the bottom half. Example of a run-on corrected in two ways. All right, so we start out with Margaret walked into her office, comma, the phone began to ring. All right, so as written, this is a comma splice, right? We got two independent clauses. We have a comma in between them, but we don't have a coordinating conjunction. It's a comma splice. So how could you fix this? Well, we've talked about several ways, but in this chapter, they point out that you could put a dependent word in front, like as Margaret walked into her office, comma, the phone began to ring. As long as you do it that way, it's grammatically fine because you're going from dependent clause, comma, independent clause. And you always have to have a comma at the end of the dependent clause if there's an independent clause after it. So that's one way to fix it. And then the book points out that you can also, put the as in front of the phone began to ring. So we could do Margaret walked into her office as the phone began to ring. And the only thing different in this case is there is no pause there. All right, why is there no pause there? Well, mainly it's because the rule that I was alluding to a moment ago, when you start with a dependent clause and then you go to an independent clause, we have to have a comma at the end of the dependent clause. But if you go from independent clause to dependent clause, there is no comma necessary. And once again, you're probably already sick of hearing it, but this is a case where you would put the comma where you put the pause, and you wouldn't put a comma where you wouldn't put a pause. So for instance, in our first way of fixing it, as Margaret walked into her office, the phone began to ring. So when we start these dependent clause sentences, when we start sentences with dependent clauses, we naturally put a pause in there in our speech, and that is exactly where your comma goes. But when we flip it around, we go independent to dependent. Margaret walked into her office as the phone began to ring. You wouldn't normally put a pause there. In fact, if you put a pause there, I dare say it would sound pretty weird. Margaret walked into her office as the phone began to ring. It just sounds weird because it's incorrect. All right. And deja vu all over again. It's not a complete list, but they have a list of commonly used dependent words on the bottom of page 340. Okay. I'm going to skip the implied that section. I mean, it's super short and it doesn't really matter that much. But yeah, that's about it for this chapter. There are some review exercises at the end. If you're curious, I've had a few people reach out to me, like if you're doing any of the exercises in your book, you ever want to reach out to me like, hey, what is the answer to blah, blah, blah. Or can I shoot you the answer key to like the exercise on 345? Always happy to do so. But that's about it for this chapter. You guys know the deal. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or feel free to text me at 863-835-2399. Y'all have a good one. Bye.